Hello everyone, this is Duan, and this week we're going to be looking at the differences between the REST API and the GraphQL API and how those differences impact the development process and the application. Let's get started. The first difference we're going to be discuss about is the entry point to the resources. So in REST and GraphQL API, they handle the access to resources differently. So the REST exposes the resource with the URL endpoints. It uses multiple URL endpoints to connect requests to different resources. In GraphQL, it also uses URL endpoints, which is the GraphQL endpoints. However, the GraphQL endpoints doesn't directly connect to the resources. The GraphQL actually uses something called a field, which is determined in the schema to connect each request to the resources. And the other difference is that in the REST API, you have resources closely coupled with the endpoints. For example, if you're requesting a user and you'll get a user data, if you're requesting for a comment, it will respond with the comment data. So you have that one-to-one linear connection between the endpoints and the resources. In GraphQL, it does this a little differently because of how the schema is determined in the GraphQL and how the relationship is declared in the GraphQL. The way on how you fetch the data is quite flexible. So you can specify the fields that you want to fetch, and the response will resolve which matches with the shape of the request. And another difference is that the REST API uses multiple HTTP methods. For GraphQL, it only uses the post method. The second difference is the resource shape and size on each of those APIs. So in REST API, it is fully determined and described by the server. What I mean by that is the server handles all the logic to get the data you need, and each of those endpoints used to access your data is also described by the server. So for example, if you're accessing a user data, you have an endpoint for a user, and if you're getting review data, you're accessing the endpoint for reviews. And it's very much described on the server side. For GraphQL, on the other hand, the shape and size of the resource is declared by the schema. So you can think of schema as a map for your data graph. It outlines where your data are, how each data relates to one another. Once the schema is in place, the shape or the size of the resource is actually described by the client. So that the client can look at our schema and says, okay, I want those resources. And the GraphQL is able to connect those requests or the fields to each of the resolver functions. The next difference is how each API structure their request and response. On the client side, the REST differentiate request using the HTTP verbs, so things like get, post, delete, and put. On the other hand, the GraphQL differentiate read and write using query and mutation keywords. And those are some of the differences when you write a request from client to those APIs. And on the server side, for REST API, you use something called the route handlers to handle the request that comes to each endpoint. Whereas the GraphQL uses what's called the resolver functions. So the difference between the route handler and resolver function is that the resolver function can be nested on GraphQL. So what I mean by that is maybe you have a field and you can call another field that relates to a different resolver function, and it will resolve as a nested field. On the GraphQL, you can have one query that's connected to many resolvers, whereas for the REST API, each of the requests is connected to one route handler function. So as a summary, I want to discuss about the advantages of each API in terms of development process. So for REST API, you can see that it has less overhead because you don't have to have a query language, you don't have to have a type system if you don't need them. And because of the less overhead, it's also easier to learn them. It's a little harder to understand GraphQL when you first started developing the API. And because of how REST API is structured and how linear it is, from one request to one response and one endpoint to one resource, it's easier to do things like rate limiting and monitoring in comparison to GraphQL, because GraphQL does have a quite nested nature and makes those things a little difficult to do. So the advantage for GraphQL is that because of the ability for the client to control what data they want, you're able to avoid overfetching data. So you can specify exactly the field you want and no more, and the GraphQL is able to provide you with exactly the data that you need. And also because of how the schema is declared for GraphQL and how the type system is in place, the responses are quite predictable. Even if the data structure is nested, it's still very predictable because you know exactly with what field they have and the type of the data they are. And one last thing about the advantage for GraphQL is it's really not necessary, or you don't really need to worry about versioning in GraphQL, because all you need to do is add a new field to your query. Although in REST API, you do have to give it a new endpoint for updated resources. So that's everything you need to know about the differences between GraphQL and REST API. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this video and would like to see more related content, be sure to like and subscribe. If you have any questions, just leave it in the comment below. And I hope to see you in the next video. Bye bye.